Good evening, and welcome to our webinar, Why Am I Still Sick? The Role of Incomplete Healing in Chronic Illness. I'm David Ward, Chief Science Officer and Director of Functional Healthcare Services for Entavita Functional Health. We're really excited that you've taken the time to join us this evening so we can share this very important information with you. Before we start, it's important to cover some housekeeping details. First, if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A, and we will do our best to address them at the end. Also, as we go along this evening, if you would like to explore working with us, we offer a complimentary 30-minute discovery consultation, and the link to schedule will be in the chat. We are recording this evening's presentation, and we'll be sending it to all participants. Also, please keep in mind that the information, comments, and opinions expressed in this presentation are those of me as the speaker, based on my clinical experience and interpretation of the literature, and is for educational purposes only, and is not intended as a substitute for medical care. The lifestyle and nutrition approach presented is not suggested as a cure for any disease. Please talk with your healthcare provider about any information you get from this presentation. Now, I'm going to be reviewing the current conventional medical approach for treating chronic illness. And frankly, it may sound like there aren't a lot of good options for truly healing from chronic illness. But I wouldn't talk about that without providing solutions. So please hang with me as I go through some of the science of the healing process as it relates to chronic illness. And later, I'll be discussing how you can take proactive steps to support a lifestyle we call enduring wellness. Now, specifically, what we're going to be covering this evening is why the current medical model, which is designed to treat acute illness, is ineffective for addressing chronic illness. How the cell danger response, the body's innate three-step healing process, deals with damage or illness to restore healthy function in your cells. Why every chronic disease is a whole body disorder involving repeated cycles of incomplete healing. How in chronic illness, the immune system creates an ongoing response to an initial triggering event that may no longer be present. How a functional healthcare approach for chronic illness treatment involves unblocking the healing cycle and not treating the symptoms of a triggering event. And Entavita's roadmap to enduring wellness, a clear process that's been proven to help you effectively enhance immune resilience and support healing over the health span. Now, whenever I present information that may be a bit controversial because it goes against an established paradigm in conventional medicine, I like to remind everyone to be open-minded, but not so open-minded that your brains fall out. One of my mentors likes to say, always start with why. So I'd like to share my why for the work that I do. And my why started in 1975, when at the age of 17, I was diagnosed with the autoimmune disease lupus. Now, as a male in 1975 with lupus, the prognosis was not particularly good. And the diagnosing doctor told my mother over the phone that she should be happy if I lived to be 30. Very long story short, I struggled with the conventional medical approach for a number of years, as I experienced many severe flare-ups and few short-lived remissions. And it was only when I discovered the functional healthcare approach that identified the underlying causes for my autoimmunity and used a targeted lifestyle-based approach to remove those triggers that I was able to achieve long-term remission. I like to say that conventional medicine kept me alive, but the functional healthcare approach gave me my life back. As I regained my health, I was asked by one of my doctors to lead support groups for people struggling with autoimmune diseases. Creating a sense of purpose by teaching others how to live well regardless of diagnosis or medical status helped me to view my health challenges in a positive way. I became a chiropractor practicing functional healthcare in order to share with as many people as possible the approach that I'm going to present this evening. So let's start with a question. What causes chronic illness? Well, it's the failure to heal. Now, that's the simple and perhaps obvious answer, but it comes with a lot of complexity. So let's dig into what that means. Now, when treating acute injury or illness, an accurate identification of the trigger or diagnosis is an important part of the standard of care that ensures matching the right treatment for the condition. And clearly, there have been notable advances in treating and preventing infectious diseases and trauma since the 1940s. But while they're effective for acute illnesses and acute complications that come and go over periods of time up to about 6 months, acute care treatment approaches have not been successful for producing cures or resolving chronic illnesses. And healthcare practitioners now spend the majority of their time and effort caring for patients with chronic diseases. And while it's common practice to treat chronic illness by using the techniques that have been proven successful for acute care medicine, when dealing with chronic illness, treatments based on acute care medicine have proven less helpful and can even cause harm by producing unwanted side effects. The reality is that every chronic illness is a whole body condition that cannot be resolved using the conventional paradigm. In chronic illness, the original triggering event is often remote and may no longer even be present. And in most chronic illnesses, caused by are caused by the biological reaction to an injury and not the initial injury or the agent itself. So it's the immune system's response to the injury. Now, this is a very recent paper. You could see that the date on this is June 2023. And this is produced from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Emerging Infectious Diseases section. And this is about the neurological manifestations of Lyme disease, called Lyme neuroborreliosis, in which the authors note that there is not a persistent infection in this ongoing condition. Now, many people who have Lyme disease respond well to antibiotic drug therapy and their disease resolves. However, a subset of individuals experience ongoing symptoms such as headache, fatigue, sleep or memory disturbance, and joint and muscle pain that persist for years to months to years after antibiotic use. And this is termed post-treatment Lyme disease symptoms or syndrome. Now, the authors note that what is driving the ongoing inflammation in the absence of an infection is not yet entirely clear. One possibility, the authors note, is that bacteria remnants, pieces of bacteria, continue to stimulate immune responses in the post-infectious period. Now, it's interesting that's one of the factors thought to contribute to post-COVID symptoms. In particular, it's the persistence of viral fragments. Now, other studies in Lyme arthritis point to infection-induced autoimmune activation as a potential reason for persistent post-infection arthritis, but it's, again, not a reaction to an ongoing infection. And in addition, genetic predisposition might contribute to dysregulated immunity. And as we noted in our prior webinar, what your doctor may not tell you about autoimmune disease, chronic inflammatory disorders are known to be a result of the interaction between genetics, lifestyle, and the environment, causing metabolic and immune system dysfunction. So multiple factors likely play a role. Now, each chronic disease can be studied in isolation as a silo, showed in this very recent publication from just 2023 in the journal Mitochondrion. And the study of a single disease can show how it's different from all other diseases. So each one of these diseases that the author, Dr. Navio, shows here are identified as individual diseases that are not connected. Now, the process of disease formation is called pathogenesis. And the pathogenesis-based approach prevalent in conventional medicine has been particularly effective for developing treatments for acute illness caused by things like physical trauma, infection, vitamin deficiencies, and poisoning, and for handling the acute complications of chronic illness. And in this approach, once a trigger is found, a strategy is developed to turn the trigger off or to reduce its effect, typically through the use of drugs. Now, this conventional perspective makes two critical assumptions. One is that each one of these conditions is a discrete entity into and of itself. And secondly, this approach makes an assumption that once a pathogenic trigger has been removed, the disease process will resolve and the individual will heal spontaneously. However, the simple removal of a trigger or treatment of a target that appears to be the cause of a symptom in a chronic disease almost never leads to complete healing or a cure. Instead, the symptom is palliated, meaning made less severe or unpleasant without removing the cause, but at the cost of having to take a medicine for life in order to keep that symptom in check. For example, insulin doesn't cure diabetes, and statins don't cure high cholesterol. And these pathogenesis-based treatments almost never allow a person to shed their chronic disease and return to a drug-free state of health. Now, this is an expansion of the previous diagram to show a different approach in which each chronic illness can be reframed as the result of an abnormal persistence of a normal phase of the healing cycle. And you could see here that while each disease entity is discrete, there are connecting roots between each of these. Now, once pathologic or pathogenic triggers have been treated or removed, chronic disease persists because healing is incomplete. And when the methods of systems biology, which recognize that interconnectedness of all body systems, are applied across several chronic disorders, their similarities are brought into focus and a common root emerges. This shared root is the failure to heal completely. It's the failure to complete the healing cycle. Now, the healing cycle is your body's built-in way to restore function to damaged systems. And it begins with the detection of stress or injury by your mitochondria and ends with recovery, return to baseline function, and adaptation to the stressor. So, using the example of a virus entering a cell, the first thing that occurs is the mitochondria in that cell. The mitochondria are the structures that we rely on to make energy that do much more than energy production. Those mitochondria detect the presence of that intruder. And your mitochondria activate something called the cell danger response, which is your body's normal, innate, three-step process to deal with damage or illness and restore healthy function in your cells. And after the danger has been eliminated and your body's gone through all three phases of the healing cycle, you're back to good health. Your body will be in a state of homeostasis, a state of sustainable balance. Chronic disease happens when your body gets stuck in one phase of the healing cycle and can't move forward. And this biology is at the root of virtually every chronic illness known, including chronic infections, autoimmune disease, myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome, or ME/CFS, which was previously referred to as chronic fatigue syndrome, Alzheimer's, dementia, and many more. So back to our question, what causes chronic illness? Well, it's an actively maintained reaction to an injury, similar to a wound that will not heal. And the illness that's left behind is not the initial injury or the agent of the injury itself. So how does this occur? Well, we start from a place of health, which is defined as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease. We encounter an infinite number of insults in the form of chemical, physical, and microbial threat, as well as psychological trauma and stress that take us from health to injury or illness. Those insults can broadly be referred to as toxins, infections, and lifestyle factors. And inflammation is the body's normal response to danger. We then move through the healing cycle by activating the cell danger response. And as noted, after the danger has been eliminated or neutralized, a sequence of anti-inflammatory and regenerative pathways is activated to reverse the cell danger response and to heal, returning to a state of health. Now, this is the same process that occurs in physical injuries, such as wound healing. And tissue repair is a simple linear process, and the stages of healing are largely sequential, although there is some degree of overlap. Now, the cellular response in the inflammatory phase is characterized by the accumulation of immune cells in the wound area. And this response is very rapid and coincides with the key signs of inflammation, including swelling or redness at the location of the lesion or injury. These immune cells are designed to contain the damage and clean up debris associated with the injury. And this initial response is designed to ramp up, address the damage, and then turn down or resolve. So you could see that it's the shortest in terms of time of all of the three phases of healing. Now, the proliferative stage is responsible for the closure of the lesion or wound itself. And the main component of a mature scar is collagen, and specific immune cells flood the area to produce this protein. The third phase of healing consists of remodeling. In this final stage, the recovery of normal tissue structure occurs, and this resolution stage is essential for restoration of function and the normal appearance and enhanced strength of the tissue. Now, in all the processes cited, it's important to emphasize that both internal and external factors can influence the events that are central to the healing process. More specifically, ongoing tissue injury. So if you have an injury that you are continually re-injuring, perhaps because you're doing inappropriate exercise, or you're stressing the tissue rather than protecting it, chronic systemic inflammatory environment, or immune system dysfunction, all of those can hinder the early closure of the wound and adversely impact the healing cycle. Now, the natural progression of the healing cycles through the stages of cell danger response 1, cell danger response 2, and cell danger response 3 correspond to the classic stages of healing. So CDR1 supports inflammation, CDR2 supports proliferation, and CDR3 promotes remodeling. And just as in the stages of wound healing, the cell danger response proceeds in a sequential fashion, with the completion of one stage necessary to progress into subsequent phases. Now, during CDR1, the first phase of the healing cycle, your cells detect a problem in your body, like an injury, dysfunction, or an infectious pathogen. And in response to the threat, your immune system is activated. First, immune cells contain any damage, for example, by trapping invading bacteria into a small area so they can't spread to other places. Next, your cells mount an attack to address the source of the danger. And this is often really when your immune system kicks in, triggering massive inflammation that destroys threats and begins the healing process. For example, you may send a rush of white blood cells to kill foreign bacteria and keep a wound from getting infected. Now, your mitochondria, and again, those are the power plants of your cells, slow down energy production, which results in fatigue. And also, the mitochondria increase oxygen concentration in the cell. Now, higher oxygen levels lead to what's known as oxidative stress, your body's natural defense mechanism. And this creates a hostile environment that destroys pathogenic invaders like viruses and bacteria. However, oxidative stress also hurts your own cells, which is why it's important to progress past this phase. If you get stuck in it, your cells are under constant oxidative stress, which causes chronic inflammation and gradually impairs the cell's function over time. Also, during CDR1, the cell releases ATP, the energy compound produced by mitochondria that enables cells to do their work, to the outside of the cell. And this extracellular or outside the cell ATP acts as a danger signal, alerting other cells that there is a threat identified. Now, once your cells have contained the damage and removed the threats, you then continue into phase 2 of the healing cycle. And during cell danger response 2, your body begins to rebuild itself. You may send stem cells to a damaged area to grow into replacement cells for those that you've lost due to the damage of the invader. You may also activate something called autophagy, which is a cleaning out of damaged or dysfunctional cells. Alternatively, your body may destroy cells that are beyond repair so that they don't continue the dysfunction, and then sends replacement material to build new cells in their place. So this phase is all about rebuilding, delivering the materials your body needs to get you back to the way you were before the original damage happened. So back to our example of wound healing. If you've had a cut that you've observed in its healing process, you've seen CDR2 in action. Your cut develops a scab, underneath which you have all the materials you need to create new skin and repair the damage. Now, the third and final stage of the healing cycle completes the recovery process. And your body takes the replacement materials distributed in CDR2 and synthesizes them into upgraded new versions of the cells you've damaged or lost. CDR3 is when your function starts to return, and your body rebuilds specific cells, puts them in place, and turns them back on, restoring communication with surrounding areas. To continue with the cut example, CDR3 is when your skin regrows, covering up your cut and getting the wound area back to normal. By the time this phase is finished, the skin is physically healed and is transmitting sensations normally back to your brain. Now, CDR3 is also a learning phase. In the case of infection, your immune system builds antibodies to protect against the threat. That way, if the infection returns, your immune cells will recognize it and can kill it quickly before it does damage. Now, physiological resilience is the ability of the body to encounter insults or threats to the body cells and tissues, perform the processes necessary to neutralize these threats, and bounce back or return to baseline without resulting in ongoing inflammation and chronic illness. So this is the completed healing cycle. And metabolic reserve is the ability to activate the healing cycle over and over and over again as insults are encountered over your lifespan. These are just some of the components of what we at Entavita call Entavita. We at Entavita call enduring wellness. The ability to encounter threats and repeatedly respond to them without causing undue or excessive damage to body tissues. Now, chronic disease happens when your body gets stuck in one phase of the healing cycle and can't move forward. So, for example, if your body gets stuck in cell danger response 1, which is containing damage and removing threats, they may overreact to a perceived threat and cause continuous inflammation that creates symptoms. An example would be allergies. Or your cells may fail to fully contain and remove a threat, causing chronic inflammation that never fully resolves. And inflammation resolution is an essential part of CDR1. And while there are some situations where it's important to provide anti-inflammatory support, in most cases, it's more important to support the natural inflammation resolution process. Inflammation is supposed to get activated, do its job, and then resolve. And if you suppress inflammation, you can actually impede the healing response. So supporting resolution of inflammation provides optimum function for the healing cycle. And I spoke about this process of inflammation resolution in great detail in our webinar, What Your Doctor May Not Tell You About Autoimmune Disease, which you can view on our YouTube channel. Now, chronic body-wide, low-level systemic inflammation that's associated with a blocked healing cycle is the unifying thread in all of these chronic diseases. So the body encounters an infinite number of insults in the form of toxins, infections, and lifestyle factors to create systemic chronic inflammation, and that drives every single one of these chronic diseases. If your cells get stuck on CDR2, growing and repairing, they may send too many repair materials and cause excess growth. Cancer, for example, happens when your cells multiply out of control, forming a tumor that can spread to other parts of the body. And if your cells get stuck in CDR3, the recovery and reconstruction phase, they may fail to create proper connections with surrounding cells, which can cause dysfunctions in the normal signaling between cells. And this can lead to states of chronic pain. This is also where the body activates the adaptive immune system with the potential for creating or perpetuating autoimmune disease. So when your cells can't complete the healing cycle, dysfunction sets in. And it won't go away until you successfully progress past the stage at which you're stuck. Completing the cycle will allow you to return to a state of health. So, new questions. Why are more people getting sick? Well, our environment is becoming increasingly more toxic. And why do people stay chronically ill? Well, as we said, because they can't heal completely. And why can't they heal? Because the healing cycle is blocked, or they are continuously being re-injured, or both. Now, your mitochondria regulate the cell danger response, as we said before, by monitoring and responding to the physical, chemical, and microbial conditions in and around the cell. And in this way, your mitochondria connect cellular health to environmental health. Now, over 7,000 chemicals are now made or imported to the U.S. for industrial, agricultural, and personal care use in amounts ranging from about 25,000 to over 1 million pounds each year. And plastic waste now exceeds 83 billion pounds per year. This chemical load creates a rising tide of man-made pollutants in the oceans, air, water, and food chain, and fewer than 5% of these chemicals have actually been tested for toxicity. Now, in the 1980s, about 5 to 10% of children lived with chronic illness. As of 2018, 40% of children, 50% of teens, 60% of adults under the age of 65, and 90% of adults over 65 live with a chronic illness, and 40% of adults have 2 or more chronic illnesses. The exposome is a term that's been proposed as a new paradigm to encompass the totality of human environmental exposures, meaning non-genetic exposures over the lifetime. And as this author notes in this article from the journal Thorax in 2014, environmental factors are main causes of the chronic non-communicable diseases that dominate worldwide mortality. This is a picture of the exposome, an individual's lifetime exposure to external and internal factors, which is the key component in the underlying driver of chronic diseases. So in our external environment, we have stress, we have lifestyle, we have indoor and outdoor air pollution, diet and food additives, medications, infections, toxins. Our internal environment toxicity includes xenobiotics, or chemicals that are not naturally produced by the body, our microbiome, in particular, our gut bacteria, and inflammation. Now, when we consider the cell danger response and incomplete healing as the underlying cause of most chronic illnesses, we need to also consider mast cell activation and limbic system dysfunction. So mast cells are part of the innate immune system. You could see them. I've got them circled here. This is your innate immune system cells. This is your adaptive immune system. And the mast cells are part of our first line of defense against foreign invaders. So mast cells are found in almost every tissue in the body, literally. Like there are only about 2 tissues, like for example, the retina of the eye, that don't have mast cells. Every other tissue has them. And their role is to coordinate the immune response to pathogens and toxins. And pathogens can be things like bacteria and viruses. Toxins can be things like mold or chemicals. So think of mast cells as being one of the major conductors of the immune cells. Mast cells are also involved in our response to our environment. So think heat, cold, light, sound, touch, smell. Basically, mast cells respond to anything involving our 5 senses. And mast cells play a role in the inflammatory process. So when activated, a mast cell can release chemical compounds called mediators that induce inflammation. So they are drivers of the inflammatory process. And one of the most famous of these mediators is histamine. So histamine release is going to cause things like swelling, redness, and itching. Those are just some of the familiar examples, but it can also cause digestive problems and brain fog, depending on where the mast cells are that get activated. Now, one of the challenges with mast cell activation is that these mediators, these chemical compounds that are released from a few mast cells, can trigger surrounding mast cells, because mast cells have receptors for the mediators that they produce. So in other words, a mast cell produces histamine. The mast cell sitting next to it has receptors for histamine, and that histamine activates that mast cell. So it's like a forest fire that starts with a little spark and slowly burns out of control. Now, mast cells have hundreds of receptors. So this is a diagram of a mast cell, and you could see some of those receptors here. And mast cells sense what's going on in the body through these receptors. And when the receptors are triggered, that triggers the mast cell response that we call degranulation, which is a release of those mediators. So imagine that this mast cell got activated and it's releasing histamine. Now, these are some of the triggers of mast cells: mold toxicity, food, chemicals such as perfume. So if you've ever gone through, this used to happen to me, walking through the perfume aisle in Macy's, when my wife and I would walk through there, I would literally go either around it or go to a different floor to get to the same place in the mall to meet her, to avoid going through that because I got so triggered. So if you're getting activated by chemicals, it could very well be mast cells. Infections, in particular, SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID, both acute and long COVID, we see significant activation of mast cells. And in long COVID, mast cell activation is one of the primary reasons for cognitive dysfunction and brain fog associated with the inflammatory response from activating mast cells in the brain. But other infections such as Lyme disease and Epstein-Barr virus can do it as well. Hormone imbalances, lack of sleep, surgery, injuries, heavy metal toxicities, stress and trauma, and many more. Now, we said earlier that increased extracellular ATP outside of the cell, triggers entry into the CDR1 stage of the healing cycle. And extracellular ATP is a damage signal that not only alerts other cells about a threat, but it's also a potent mast cell activator. And so as long as extracellular ATP is present because you're stuck in cell danger response phase 1, there's a potential for ongoing mast cell activation. Now, mast cell activation is prevalent in about 17% of the general population. And we talked about some of the things that receptors respond to. And some of these are persistent threats. Mold toxicity, for example, will continue to trigger the mast cells until it's addressed. And the same is true with tick-borne diseases like Lyme or Bartonella. It's also true with chronic small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or SIBO, small intestinal fungal overgrowth, or CFO, candida, or chronic viral infections. And as these kinds of pathogens persist, inflammatory mediators continue to be released in an immune response designed to protect you. Mast cell activation can also happen with stress, surgery, and exposure to electromagnetic fields. Food allergies and sensitivities can keep triggering mast cells. Pesticides and other chemicals in air, water, and food can keep triggering mast cells. And chronic stress is just a huge trigger of mast cell activation. Now, we live in a very stressful world, and just because this stress is common doesn't mean it's normal or healthy. And mast cells are particularly sensitive to what we think of as normal, everyday, or chronic stress. And we also live in a world loaded with toxins, as I said earlier, in the air we breathe, in the water we drink, and in the food that we eat. So we're just inundated with things that can activate mast cells. Now, some of the symptoms by organ system can include in the gut, rapid onset, meaning it can be almost immediate onset after eating, drinking, of things like sweating, flushing, palpitations, swelling of the tongue, gas, bloating, nausea. General symptoms can include malaise, especially post-exertional malaise, which is one of the most common symptoms that we see post-COVID. Also, fatigue, temperature dysregulation, either too hot or too cold, and fluctuations where you could be too hot one minute, too cold the next minute. A lot of times in women, we attribute this to hormonal changes, which it can be, but it can also be from mast cell activation. Sensitivities, including multiple chemical sensitivities sensitivities to food, touch, smell, light, sound, EMFs, as we said earlier. In the lungs, wheezing, shortness of breath and air hunger, feeling like you just can't get enough air into your lungs, laryngitis, bronchitis, and in the skin, rashes of every description. Any kind of rash, any kind of skin lesion can be associated with mast cells. The skin is just loaded with mast cells. And the mast cells in the skin have receptors. There's 4 different types of mast cell receptors. The mast cells in the skin have all the receptors. So they are activated by a lot of things. And in particular, rashes that are associated with itching, as well as flushing and hives, are common in mast cell activation. In the sinus and oral cavity, you can get itching in the throat, postnasal drip, congestion, sinusitis, runny nose, sore throat. Cardiovascular symptoms can be lightheadedness, weakness, dizziness, vertigo, and even fainting, heart palpitations and arrhythmia, chest pains, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, meaning when you rise from a seated position, your heart rate increases dramatically, and unusual swelling. Pelvic pain, bladder pain, cystitis, musculoskeletal pain in diffuse and shifting presentations resembling fibromyalgia, often poorly responsive to treatment. Neurologically, headaches, paresthesias, meaning things like numbness and tingling or pins and needles feelings that are not physiological. So they don't follow the established pattern of how a nerve, when it gets disrupted, would typically affect a limb. And so very often, physicians will discount non-physiological paresthesias as being, it's all in your head. And what we refer to as psychiatric symptoms, such as anxiety, depression, mood swings, cognitive impairment and brain fog, difficulties with focus, memory, and concentration, as well as insomnia. Now, if you didn't see your symptoms listed here, it's only because the list is too long, and I couldn't list all of them. But it's still possible that mast cell activation could be involved if you have a chronic condition. It's also important to note that all of the symptoms that I just noted can also be associated with mold toxicity, Lyme disease, Bartonella, and other tick-borne co-infections. And in many cases, an individual can have multiple of these biotoxins. So it's essential to get a good history and appropriate diagnostic testing to identify correctly as many of these triggers as possible. Now, in terms of treatment for mast cells, number 1 is reduce the production of the mediators from the mast cells with what we call mast cell stabilizers. Interfere with the mediators that are released by blocking the receptors so they'll have less effect, and counter the unavoidable effects, meaning symptom management. But the key to mast cell activation, find the trigger and eliminate it. Now, when we talk about mast cells, the importance of considering and treating the limbic system and the polyvagal nerve system cannot be emphasized. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit now. The limbic system is a collection of distinct but interconnected brain regions that play several important roles in fear, stress reactivity, learning, and memory. And it's the part of the brain involved in our behavioral and emotional responses, especially when it comes to behaviors we need for survival. The structures of the limbic system are buried deep within the brain, and 2 of the major structures are the hippocampus and the amygdala, both of which play an important role in memory. Now, the amygdala is specialized for the input and processing of emotion, while the hippocampus is essential for certain aspects of memory, such as relating facts and figures and remembering life experiences. And during emotional reactions, these 2 brain regions interact such that memories are stored more deeply when there is a strong emotion associated with them. Now, the autonomic nervous system is the primary regulator of important systems in our body, including our heart, respiration rate, and digestion. It's constantly sending and receiving information between the brain and body, helping us to respond to changes in our internal and external environment. And our autonomic nervous system is largely influenced by a nerve that's hugely important to our overall well-being. And you may have heard of this. It's the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve is the longest cranial nerve in the body. It stretches from the brainstem at the base of our brain all the way down to the digestive tract. And it influences our emotional and physiological states and the way that we respond to anxiety, stress, and trauma. Now, when humans feel safe, their nervous system supports growth, health, and restoration, while they simultaneously become accessible to other humans without feeling or expressing threat or vulnerability. And while acute threat reactions are adaptive and necessary for survival, chronic maintenance of threat responses can lead to a compromised functional state. And these chronic changes can be self-maintained even though a threat is no longer present due to long-term alterations in learned responses to threat cues. So things that we perceive as threatening. And symptoms associated with the response to threat can, in and of themselves, perpetuate a threat reaction. Now, this diagram indicates all of the structures that the vagus nerve innervates. And the polyvagal, poly meaning more than one, vagus, so polyvagal theory proposes that the ventral vagal complex, the sympathetic nervous system, and the dorsal vagal complex promote coordinated response to threats. Now, nerve pathways in our autonomic nervous system subconsciously decide through our senses in every moment whether a person or situation is safe, dangerous, a threat, without involving the thinking parts of our brain through a process called neuroception. So the evaluation of risk and safety reflexively triggers shifts in the autonomic nervous system without requiring conscious awareness. So first we have the ventral vagal complex. And in this state, our social engagement system is active within the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. So this is our rest and relax state where humans are designed to exist most of the time. Our nervous system in this state is well regulated and we're ready to connect and engage with others. And what we're experiencing in the now is based on a feeling of safety and security in the world. And most importantly, our fight or flight response is inhibited or turned off. So this is our centered, true self state where all social interaction, connection, and creativity occurs. Now, under a perceived threat, and I'll emphasize the word perceived, and that perception can be conscious or unconscious, the ventral vagal complex, which is the most rapidly responsive system, withdraws its inhibitory influence on mobilization into fight or flight, or the sympathetic response. And it's the most rapidly responsive because as a survival mechanism, you have to be able to jump into heightened alert in the presence of a threat in order to assure your survival. So next we have the sympathetic nervous system. And this state of the autonomic nervous system activates when we feel, when we sense a feeling of unease, when that neuroception triggers a sense of danger. And we feel the need to take action to avoid or resolve the perceived threat, best known as the fight or flight response. In this state, the world feels dangerous or overstimulating, resulting in the feeling of threat or danger and feeling the need to either fight or flee from a situation to seek safety. And again, this neuroception takes place outside of our conscious awareness. So we may not even notice that we've shifted into a fight or flight response, but our body's stress response physiology is activated. And the most common and well-known chemical associated with the fight or flight response is cortisol. Now, in the short term, cortisol is anti-inflammatory, but under states of chronic sympathetic arousal, where cortisol is chronically elevated, it actually promotes inflammation. And this is a way that you can stay stuck in cell danger response stage 1. Now, let's talk a little bit about breathing and its effect on the autonomic nervous system as it relates to threat perception. So, optimal breathing is a match between the amount of air exchanged and the body's immediate needs. And it's a balance between oxygen intake and carbon dioxide release. The body continuously seeks an optimum balance between those two gases through breathing. Now, the introduction of memory, association, and the ability to imagine and anticipate all complicate the process of breathing regulation. And anticipating the need for action and preparing for it by changing the breathing pattern is a natural survival process in humans. And the anticipation of action may be certain, or it may be a prediction based on prior experience. So you may change your breathing pattern in response to something that you're predicting or assuming or projecting will occur based on prior experience. And conscious recall is not necessary for anticipatory adjustments in breathing to occur. And this mechanism triggers preparation and breathing changes faster than conscious awareness can interpret the meaning of a potential threat cue. Now, breathing can be altered in the absence of appropriate stimulus when the brain tries to prepare for something based on a projection from past experience. And remember, memories associated with strong emotions, such as in past physical or psychological trauma, are more deeply encoded and can have a profound effect on breathing alteration and the activation of the fight or flight response. So breathing changes can represent conditioned responses to stimuli that carry the signal of a current threat or were associated with a prior threat signal. So in this diagram, we could see that chronic stress, traumatic events, whether they're current or in the past, and unconscious fears all can trigger a feeling of anxiety. That causes the body to go on alert and triggers the fight or flight or sympathetic response. The upper body muscles become tense and breathing becomes more rapid. Carbon dioxide is excessively blown off through the overbreathing, changing our blood pH, which becomes more alkaline. That causes our smooth muscles, such as the muscles that line our arteries, to constrict and narrow, restricting blood supply, increasing blood pressure, and lowering oxygen to brain and tissues, leading to fatigue and brain fog. Now, these symptoms can be frightening, which stimulates anxiety, and then you get into this whole looping cycle. In addition, that fight or flight response causes a rapid pulse, sweating, butterflies in the stomach, and muscles tensing. And those symptoms can be frightening and again stimulating anxiety. Also, that upper body tension and more rapid breathing can cause increased swallowing rate and bloating. And that can cause symptoms that are frightening. So again, you get a secondary loop. And then you can get aching muscles, head and neck pain. You can get, because of the overbreathing and the change in blood pH, calcium lost through the urine, and that low calcium causes nerves and muscles to function poorly, and that results in more sensitive nerves that sense damage and relay that information to the brain, increasing pain perception. Now, we said the amygdala was associated with emotions, but it's also a chemosensor, a sensor of chemicals that detects carbon dioxide level. And in particular, it detects increased carbon dioxide, which can occur with breath holding. So some people in a stressful situation will hold their breath. The amygdala detects the increased carbon dioxide in the circulating blood, and it stimulates a fear or panic response and changes breathing. So forces you to stop holding your breath and forces you to overbreathe to bring carbon dioxide levels back into balance. So that panic response can also cause you to get into this exact same loop. Now, the third part of the polyvagal system is the dorsal vagal complex. And this is a primal part of the human experience. And it's the path of least resort. It's a place of immobilization when the sympathetic response is insufficient at protecting us or eliminating a perceived threat. And in this state, a sense of hopelessness may take over, and our mind and body move into conservation and withdrawal mode. We feel disconnected from ourselves and from the world. So the dorsal vagal state is our freeze state, when we feel our lives are so immediately threatened that we become immobilized. Now, keep in mind that all of the processes of sensing threat and responding to it can occur outside your conscious perception. So you may be in a state of dorsal vagal activation and not know it, other than you feel these symptoms. And when recruited for defense responses, the dorsal vagus produces a vagus nerve surge that inhibits metabolic functions. It slows heart rate, it reduces digestion processes, and promotes behavioral shutdown. Now, a chronic compromised state driven by activation of the dorsal vagal can give rise to the emergence of disorders of gut-brain interaction, which we previously referred to as functional gastrointestinal disorders. So these are the kind of gastrointestinal disorders where you'll get an endoscopy or a colonoscopy or some sort of a scan, and no structural abnormality is found, but you still have digestive symptoms. So it's more of a functional problem. And recently, because of the recognition of how the vagus nerve is involved in these conditions, it's now referred to as gut-brain interaction disorders. Altered pain signaling can be part of this chronic systemic issue. And remember, we said that being stuck in cell danger response 3 can cause dysfunction in the normal signaling between cells, leading to states of chronic pain. And studies suggest that abuse and trauma experiences may be the key to understanding the underlying or root causes of pain conditions of fibromyalgia or digestive disorders such as irritable bowel syndrome when they're viewed from a polyvagal perspective. So, how do we approach incomplete healing from a functional healthcare perspective? At Entavita, our approach starts with health history and advanced diagnostics. Because when an individual's medical history, signs, symptoms, and perhaps most importantly, their story are viewed through a functional healthcare lens, the root causes of chronic illness can be apparent. And as we noted, addressing limbic system dysfunction, especially through the polyvagal perspective, is an essential process in rebalancing the nervous system and unblocking the healing response. Now, we work with a wonderful psychologist who teaches techniques that enable an individual to both check in with their brain state to determine if they're operating in a manner that supports social engagement and growth, or one of threat responsiveness, and to also reset their brain states as indicated. And this is also where we provide techniques for activating the parasympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system to promote ventral vagal activation. Normalizing immune response is also a foundational key to our approach, including addressing mast cell activation and imbalances in cells of the adaptive immune system. And again, I went to this in great detail about how we do this in the webinar, why your doctor may not tell you about autoimmune disease, and I encourage you to view it on our YouTube channel. Next, as we travel along our roadmap for supporting health, we support detoxification before we address toxins and infections or promote healthy microbiomes. Now, sometimes these 2, 4, and 6 here can be interchangeable, but we definitely need to support detoxification before we address toxins and infections. If we find that you have a toxin or an infection and we try to remove that and your detoxification system is blocked, it will cause you to get stuck in cell danger response 1. So it's important that we do this first. And we address the toxins and infections that were identified here through our advanced diagnostics, and we promote healthy microbiome, not only in the gut, but also in the oral cavity, in the respiratory tract, and elsewhere. Next, we assist individuals in making personalized lifestyle modifications with the support of health coaching to optimize sleep, manage stress, and ensure proper nutrition, movement, and exercise. And these lifestyle-based modifications support the enhancement of resilience and metabolic reserves, ultimately promoting an opportunity for living a life of enduring wellness. So this is our enduring wellness roadmap, which helps us to identify the factors contributing to your incomplete healing and allows us to provide personalized lifestyle-based solutions for improved vitality. Now, this graph shows that before the current healthcare system, people tended to die earlier, usually from infections and trauma. And with the current standard of care, we tend to see a longer lifespan, but with a gradual decline in health and vitality, including declining immune health, which is known as immunosenescence. Now, nearly 1/2 of the US population used 1 or more prescription drugs in the last 30 days. 1/4 used 3 or more, and 1 in 8 used 5 or more. And a recent study showed the US continues to far outspend other developed nations while seeing worsening health outcomes, such as being likely to suffer from multiple chronic illnesses and having shorter life expectancy. Clearly, the conventional healthcare model fails to confront both the causes of and solutions for complex chronic illness. But research supports a third option. Through a personalized lifestyle-based approach, we may have the possibility of a new trajectory, one that combines a more consistent quality of life and the overall length of life to support health and vitality over the health span. Now, we've shown that chronic illness results from a failure to heal due to blockage of the healing cycle associated with the cell danger response. And we've also shown that there are multiple triggers, including toxins, infections, psychological and trauma and stress, that activate the cell danger response. While some in conventional medicine acknowledge the importance of lifestyle and the environment as contributing factors to chronic illness, most physicians are simply not trained to assess for the underlying causes of incomplete healing or to recommend personalized lifestyle-based strategies for prevention or reversal. Studies have noted that it takes up to 17 years for new basic science research to make its way into clinical practice, so your doctor may not even be aware of this information. And in addition, the conventional medical approach may not have a therapeutic option until the diagnosis of a discrete disease is made. Now, we've shown that we can identify and resolve the underlying causes of incomplete healing and chronic illness using a personalized lifestyle-based treatment strategy approach. And we encourage you to take action now, to take proactive steps to support a healthier cell danger response, because your mind and body today are the results of your habits yesterday, and your mind and body tomorrow are the results of your habits today. I want to thank you again for spending your time with us. We did run a couple of minutes over. I especially want to thank those who were attending from the East Coast who stayed up way past their bedtime to hang with us. I know that was a lot of information, and I hope that what you've seen this evening has provided you with a clearer picture about how chronic illness results from a failure to heal due to being stuck in the cell danger response. And I also hope that what you've seen this evening inspires you to take action to support your healing. We have different programs available to assist you in doing just that, including individual one-on-one care and also group programs that focus primarily on education and empowerment. So if you'd like to explore these options further, please click on the link in the chat to schedule a complimentary discovery consultation. I'm looking to see, I don't think that there were any other questions. And so if any of you do have any questions that you want to submit, you can email us at admin@entavita.com, and we'll do our best to address them.